This is the VIP Podcast, Virginia in Politics. Let's listen to host Chris Saxman explore the personalities and policies that connect the Commonwealth. The VIP Podcast is brought to you by the VCTA, Broadband Association of Virginia, and Virginia Free. The views and opinions expressed here do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of the VCTA and Virginia Free or our sponsors.
Chris Saxman on the VIP Podcast, brought to you by VCTA, the Broadband Association of Virginia, and Virginia Free, of which I am the Executive Director today. My very lovely guest, former colleague of mine from the General Assembly days, Delegate Vivian Watts. Great to have you.
Great to see you, Chris.
You've been in the General Assembly
long time.
You said it, not me, but congratulations for all the years and all the successes you've had in the General Assembly. The citizens of your district keep sending you back. Why do you think that is?
I have a couple of answers to that, a couple of threads. When I first got down here, I was embarrassed when people would say, "How do you like it?" And I was embarrassed because my real answer was, "I love it."
Do you really?
And
you're
when,
good at it. You're good at it. I'm going to interrupt you here. You're good at it. There aren't many people who can withstand the pressures, the time, the work that's involved, because we all know it's a lot of work, and all the politics back home and statewide and national. Mm-hmm. But you seem to have this ability to work with people earnestly,
always earnestly,
and get the job done, and still keep a smile on your face. You're not a morning person by admission. You became
yes. We were just saying, right?
And here you are, happy as all get out, ready to do this.
Right. So that's part of it. The other part, as you just mentioned, I'm a nerd at heart. Really am. I'm an introvert and I'm a nerd, and so all of the challenge of the General Assembly is also another aspect that I genuinely love, to try to figure out something, and the satisfaction of trying to really get where it's going. Now, the third thing I would say, as I've said in more than a few, why are you still there? And I said, I asked myself that same thing about 6-8 years ago. It was an awful session. What is one thing after another? Just, what am I doing here? And decided that, if I stay up to date, and that's the nerd in me who enjoys the challenge of staying up to date, then all of that breadth and depth of experience that I have has a real value in the system, if I stay up to date. So I'm not just an old curmudgeon, but someone who's really applying it.
I was like a 45-year-old curmudgeon. When I got out, I can't do the math off the top of my head when I got out exactly, but this place wears on people, and yet it hasn't done that to you. You're resilient. You're pleasant almost every day. Let's be honest. We all have our days, but you have the ability to turn off one bill and turn on another bill. You don't get lost in the previous fight.
You have to. And I observed that as a woman coming in when there were very few women, and wending my way through that, because I had 4 years of service, then into the cabinet for a total of a 10-year break.
You were Secretary of Transportation and Public Safety.
That's right, dual secretariat. And so what I saw as I'm trying to figure this all out is that, most guys had competitive sports in their background. Mm-hmm. So I am a big champion of Title IX.
Okay.
And having females have that same kind of competitive experience, so that when you come off the playing field, the game's behind you, and now it's collegial. And I saw that again and again legislatively, of how men handled that, whereas women tended to hold a grudge a little bit more.
Okay.
And it was just observing how the process really has to work in our short sessions. You cannot afford to get personal. No. You just get off track.
Well, let's explain the long and the short sessions. One session is 60 days, the other one's 46.
Both are short by national standards.
But it's very short by national standards, but the difference between the short and the long session is the same amount of legislation, just 15 less days.
That's right.
So it's jammed in there.
And I have described
those are exhausting.
Yeah.
Short sessions are exhausting.
The 45-day session, you don't have a time to take a second look at anything. So there's some bad stuff that moves its way forward, and there's some very good stuff that if you worked on it, had another meeting or two, would really be something that needs to go.
And the short session is always an election year too. So it's not only super intense legislatively, it's extremely intense politically, because as soon as you come out of short session, you're right into the primaries.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
This morning in the Richmond Times-Dispatch, the NAACP of Virginia, or Northern Virginia, was it Virginia NAACP came out in favor of having elections this year for the new maps.
All right.
What are your thoughts on having elections this year?
Well, okay.
You want some coffee?
That's right. So, again, back history. When I first came in, I ran 3 years in a row.
Oh, you were 81, 82, 83.
Yeah, I'm one of those folks.
So you remember it.
I remember running 1, 2, 3, and they were full out new elections. They were not just you were in and you continued. Right. You had a constituency, etc. So it will be challenging. And while there will be perhaps, I would like to believe, an opportunity for some of this polarization to actually be worked out in dialogue as you're with people and going back and forth on what people really are concerned about under issues rather than just the polarization. While I hope that's the case, I fear in today's climate that it might even polarize us even more. But whatever happens, I will do it. I haven't read the NAACP's statement. Certainly waiting 9 years in a decade between redistricting before the courts finally ruled that the 2010 redistricting had really done an injustice by packing blacks into as few districts as possible. So when that was corrected, that's where you saw the significant shift in those elected to the House of Delegates. Rather, the sooner you make that correction, the better. Some of the districts, as I look at them, are certainly my district. My district is...
New district.
Yeah, my new district. In 2000, I had 40% new voters.
Okay.
Because, quite frankly, no small amount.
You're an incumbent, that's scary because you're like,
and it was what everyone talks about as far as gerrymandering.
Right.
I was the westernmost Democrat in Fairfax County, pack all the Republican territory into that district, make the districts inside the Beltway that much safer. The Republicans were in charge of the redistricting, and that's why I got 40% new district. I survived it, all my new best friends, and off we went. So then another decade passes, and I won't go into the details, but here I am with 45% new district.
This one is 45%.
In 2010.
Oh, in 2010. So, from 40,
so at 40,
45.
Even more than 40 the next time. This time I've got about 60% new district.
Well, it sounds like it goes in your favor because you have to get out there and meet your constituents all over again.
Except that, keep in mind, and for all of your listening audience, in Fairfax County in Northern Virginia, we do not have local media. It is out there knocking on the doors, which means you know the really, really know the territory. But all of our media is national, international oriented. Once humorously, when I came back in after being secretary, the Washington Post is doing their obligatory 15-minute interview, and she's setting up to do her recording. We're sitting in my living room, and I said, with humor, well, I figure I'll have made it if I get in the obituary page of the Washington Post, to which she gave me a 5-minute explanation of what the standards were of whether or not you got in the obituary page of the Washington Post. So this is where
that's the
we
difference.
are really low on the totem pole.
Right.
So our re-election very much means a lot of personal effort.
A lot of shoe leather on the street.
A lot of shoe leather.
Yeah, and that's what people don't understand about the differences in Virginia politics and how the ground game is different. When in the Shenandoah Valley, where I was from, we would get overexposed in the media because the media was just looking for content. And they go, "Can we do an interview? Yeah, come down to the office." And then my colleagues would be upset with
that.
My colleagues would be upset because I was on TV so much. All I did was answer the phone, and the TV3 guy would come over and do a bit, and we're done.
When I've traveled in Virginia, and you turn on the motel TV, there's one of your colleagues, and you say, "Geez, I've never been on."
and you've been in the House of Delegates in this public service since when did you first come in the House?
Forever. I first was elected. I first served. Were sworn in 82.
82. So, okay, so you ran in 81.
And then
served in 82.
Ran in 82.
So 40 years of service.
Yeah.
Continual service. almost. Disruption for a year or two after you got a secretariat?
No, I had 4 years at the Secretariat, and I was out for 6. I was directing the Fairfax CASA program, which is a major dealing with the worst cases of child abuse, neglect. There are a number of reasons why I went into that. And one of them was the fact that I'd had a dual secretariat where I had prisons as well as pavements. And I really realized some of the mental health issues that we're dealing with, the history of people who end up in prison. Child abuse is no small part of that.
Oh, absolutely.
So if I was going to do any kind of a balance for all of the prison space that I'd built, because it was on the beginning of the war on drugs and our prison populations were just skyrocketing.
Right.
If I was going to go back and do something preventative, that's where I had the best understanding.
So that's what I guess called you back.
Mm-hmm. And then it was difficult to leave that because I was actually doing something as opposed to just talking. But realizing, since I'd been in the General Assembly, what little experience there was in the Assembly with the juvenile court and with issues of dysfunctional families, it has begun to shift and change, but realized that if I had the ability to get elected, that was an important arena for me to be able to bridge those concerns and bring some understanding.
Right. We still have so many problems in this area. What is it, and given your experience in the public sector, private sector, arena, and
Chamber of Commerce,
and all these areas, what direction are we heading in? Because you came in, 81, 82. Things have changed politically, internet, social media, and we're still having these significant issues on mental health and family breakdown and prison populations. These issues don't seem to be going away. They seem to be exacerbated over time. And is the snowball rolling downhill and picking up more snow in these very difficult social issues?
And the reason why, if the camera had my kind of weird smile, I'm going to answer you, Chris, in vintage Vivian. This is me speaking.
This is from the gut.
This is from my gut. Now, the years that I was very active in my community, again, I'm a numbers person at heart, and the way in which I supported the efforts for schools and family services, et cetera, was to really get a handle on the budget. And I also did a major study as a citizen of Fairfax's tax base, and my second year's study was 15 pages, single space with footnotes, all about the business taxes, the non-residential taxes, which brought me into an understanding there of the balance of resources that we have to be able to tap and have as far as stability and budgeting.
Okay.
Give you all of that by my answer to your question is we are still in a phase of cut taxes, cut taxes, cut taxes. And even though Virginia per 1,000 personal income is one of the low tax states, boy, it doesn't go that way. So when I was Secretary of Transportation and Public Safety with state police under the Secretariat, we were regularly recruiting people with post-high school education, usually 2 years. They were our recruiting class, quality. Mm-hmm. Now, police recruits are GED. Mm-hmm. Huge difference in competitive salaries over the 20 years. You can't keep on cutting, and not recognize that. Mental health. One of the huge problems in our mental health crisis, besides some of the reforms that we're trying to get in place, and how costly, how we've got to put money into community services, upfront cost as you actually do prevention and really dealing with the person's need.
Right.
Up front, it's going to cost a little bit more. But also, our salaries in mental health, in our mental health hospitals, if you open up a Amazon distribution center in the next county, by God, you're going to lose half of your staff, of your floor staff, because it's a better paying job and actually safer than an overloaded mental health hospital setting. And teachers, came out during the campaign, and you know me, I'm going to check the numbers. I'm not just going to.
Well, you're very good at it.
Yeah.
You're very diligent.
When
very
it was
diligent.
said, wait, Virginia has the lowest teachers' salaries, I'm thinking, whoa. PolitiFact, and then I went back to the original as well, confirmed that compared to salaries in Virginia, teachers are paid the lowest relative to the salaries in Virginia than any other state.
Relative to the private sector around them.
Yeah, which means that takes into your climate of cost of living and
Sure.
all kinds of aspects. I think it's a very good comparison, because a salary here and a salary in Wyoming and a salary in it's a whole different.
Well, and the disparity, especially in the Northern Virginia jurisdictions where you have inordinate amount of private sector wealth. I mean, Loudoun County is the wealthiest county in the country per capita. Fairfax is no slouch itself. There's a lot of wealth there, so the wealth disparity would naturally be more pronounced there versus in the rural districts.
Except, and I recently saw this about 2 years ago, we also have the widest spread in the nation in cost of living, second only to California. Now, the
cost of living is
so
a big
when you
problem.
talk about the wealth of Northern Virginia, you're talking about salaries needing to be a third higher, partly because housing is so much higher.
Is that because we're not building enough houses in Northern Virginia?
That's certainly part of it, absolutely.
The inventory is so low. Because we went through, when we served together in the House, there was a slow growth, no growth phase of life because we thought we could control growth and not be able to do that.
But that's
exacerbating
that's a
the problem.
lot of years ago.
Well, 15 years is...
There's been some significant court setting rulings, and that's not really the issue.
So it's not that way anymore.
The issue is flat out nationwide cost of
Yeah,
housing.
but California and Virginia have the same problems, though. They're restricting inventory in their housing markets, and California just recently passed legislation to sort of undo that. But what's the contributing factor in Northern Virginia?
Northern Virginia, just staying with that point, is part of the body of the law of the Commonwealth as decided by court decisions. And there were some major court decisions that said no property rights in Northern Virginia are just as valid as they are anywhere else in Virginia, and you can't make those restrictions. So then you have the issue of cost of housing with the lack of land close to good transportation. You have the cost of housing issues that are nationwide. And I love a good chart. I wish I had this with me.
They were saying, is she bringing
My
the chart
hands
today?
always are doing it. The chart was, here are the elements of household spending: transportation, medical, education, food, housing. Here's 75 years, every decade, of the proportion that people spend on each one of these areas. The chart is very informative, 75 years. There was a time when food was far more a portion of. The one that has grown the most by a lot, housing.
So what do we do about it?
So housing is way up here, food is down here.
So
when we look at our tax structure, our localities, our counties are still depending on a colonial tax structure of taxing housing, which is not a direct tax on wealth, as opposed to where our school funding comes from is all adjusted.
Taxing housing is not a tax on wealth?
Not directly, because you can eat a lot more rice and a lot more basic
right.
At shopping at Walmart or wherever.
But the asset of a house.
But a house, you have to have that roof over your head.
Of course.
And if you don't have housing that is middle income, then these folks are pressuring the low income housing, and the prices at the lower end have particularly
relative
to wages are particularly burdensome. As you get up into the higher ends, it's not as burdensome.
No, it's not.
And our tax structure says you can only have locally one tax rate. It can't be graduated. So I'm going to take the same percentage of taxes from the lowest of incomes as I am from the highest of incomes, and I can't make that adjustment for the high end. When you're a new growth county, which is certainly part of my history with Fairfax, your housing price is a little bit more related to your ability to pay. But as we age, I represent a lot of folks who have aged in place 30, 40, 50 years in their house, and there's no way that the assessed value of that house and their retirement and ability to pay are in sync. And so this produces a tremendous amount of pressure on the real estate tax only being just so elastic. You really can't reach the wealth.
So you can't, at the state level, reach the higher level income people to pay more? Is that what you're suggesting?
No, I'm saying, okay.
How do we mitigate this problem? We can identify the problem and say housing's a problem. Everyone agrees housing costs are a problem. It's been one of the problems to Virginia's growth because it has slowed down growth. People are leaving Virginia, more so especially in the 25 to 40-year-old cohort. They're leaving after college. It's just too expensive here. They go to other states and they get...
And they got their student loans to pay off and all this other things.
Right. Yeah. And we've invested all this money in their K through 12 and higher education life, and now they're leaving. We've invested in them, and now the talent's leaving. It's a real problem.
It's a real problem.
But how do we turn that tide in housing costs, especially in more expensive areas?
I'm a great fan of something, talk about short session and something not making it all the way. I really like the approach, and I'm not going to use the right terminology, but a major tax credit program that is attached to a long-standing federal tax program to deal with producing and keeping in stock low-income housing, not just producing low-income housing, taking advantage of a tax credit, and then it resells and it goes out of the low income. The federal program, if we augmented it, as was recommended by the housing study, you could have a significant difference both in new housing stock and renovation of housing stock, so that you also are keeping housing in established neighborhoods, not just building it out in Loudoun.
Right, which exacerbates your transportation stress.
Yeah, all of those issues, and it makes your transportation investments that much more cost effective, rather than just moving out.
So build in versus build out.
So this is one where I think the initial budget impact was $20 million. It really needed to be $40 million to make the kind of difference that we need to do. And
we'll explain that for folks.
The cost of the tax credit. If you enacted the tax credit, every tax credit or deduction is actually an expenditure. So you need to be able to say, okay, we're going to use this money in this way. It won't be revenue that's available for anything else, like mental health salaries and teachers' salaries and all of these other things we were talking about.
Okay. In that respect, I think it's safe to say the grocery tax is a bit of a conundrum for you.
It sure is. Yeah, right. In fact, I was just working on it last night, trying to figure how the language right now is not where it should be. If we do the grocery tax, we've really
the grocery tax cut that Governor Youngkin ran on. It's two parts. It's one
and
is state,
I'm going
one
to
is
say
local.
it's been on the Democratic agenda. Wow, I know. I remember Kane when he was governor talking about it.
For a while.
Yeah, Warner's been. Yeah, it's been, and we've always wanted to do it, which is why it's only the grocery tax is only 2.5%. When we changed it a number of years ago, we would have loved to have taken it off in everything.
I think I remember having that conversation, taken from the sales tax to
but the cost was prohibitive. So now that we may be doing it, the challenge is exactly the same. How do you backfill the about 18% revenue? Let me use a rounder number, 15%, because I've seen it in a number of, about 15% loss of revenue.
For localities.
For localities, specifically for education.
This is a big hit to the bottom line.
Because that 15% comes back on the base of school-age population.
Right, which gets into whole formulas of
huge change. And then the local sales tax, and that's the only major mitigation to the real estate tax. And if you take a bite out of your sales tax, you're going to put more pressure on the cost of housing through real estate taxes.
This gets into the whole
and
tax
then you've
reform,
got transportation.
But this gets into the whole tax reform issue because it's so complicated. When people say, "Oh, just get rid of the grocery tax," whoa. It's very complicated because all these different formulas are woven into the budget and have state and local impacts. is there a point at which we just have to say we need to hit the easy button and hit the simple button when it comes to taxation and just go and have it and just rip the whole thing out and start over again and say, look, if you had to do it over again, how would you do it?
Oh, hey,
we've got B-poll, we've got the car tax cut, we've got all these things.
Me personally, I'd give me a half hour and a chalkboard, and I would
just throw it in a bumper sticker for us.
But we all have a role to play in the General Assembly, the different personalities and backgrounds and talents that come forward. And interestingly enough, when I first hit here, again, I'm a numbers person at heart.
You're a nerd.
And I knew there was something wrong with the way road funds were allocated. And my county wasn't, well, I'm just going to put something in anyway. So I did. And now I've got this bill in, and I'm invited to a meeting about the state highway funding formula. And I'm thinking, I'm a freshman, I'm going to embarrass myself. I better read it. So I read the highway funding formula. So I go to the meeting, and I'm the only one who's ever read the highway funding formula. I go back, the reason I'm saying all this kind of detail, that has been multiplied and multiplied and multiplied, where there are some of us who are numbers people who go into the detail. And I'm trying my darndest in this short session to make fill a major hole in the wording to make sure that the school funding formula per school child is made whole. Because right now the focus on the House version is only on making the local sales tax whole. Well, that's only half the picture, and it's a problem, particularly problematic picture as far as rural areas or areas where retail has sort of gone out to a major shopping mall, or in many times, in my experience, the growth happens first with all the school kids, but I was shopping in the city of Alexandria because it was the only mall available. So all of that, if you don't keep that factor of return on the basis of school-age population, you are making a very major impact, and it's not even. You got those that have will get more if they've got the shopping mall. Those that have the school kids, it's not being addressed.
And that creates more disparity in outcomes because the rural areas become discompetitive, not even non-competitive, become discompetitive to other suburban areas with high growth and lower tax rates marginally.
So if this gets worked out, it has to be worked out in fine detail. And when you talk about shouldn't we just declare and do? It'll be done, and it'll look like, well, of course.
Well, that's always the problem, though, when we talk about that.
Because
so much is so solidified, and you want to tinker with the machine. People go,
But if you do that, I have on
tax reform goes back decades, and no one ever seems to tackle it because it gets complicated.
Well, yeah,
right?
And also tax reform.
Republican, Democrat doesn't matter.
Tax reform, by definition, if you've got inequities here and you're going to make some cuts, then you balance it, reform, zero sum, with some increases. And especially in the last 2 decades, I will use Grover Norquist, no tax pledge. He regards such reform as being a non-starter. You do not raise taxes, you just cut. And you can't do reform.
Well, because I think we get caught in this false dichotomy, this false narrative that if you raise a tax rate here, that's raising taxes. If you lower it overall in the overall revenue, because the corollary to that was revenue neutrality. As long as it didn't intentionally raise the revenue for the state, it was okay. Because I remember we had this tax battle in communications, and satellites were going to get taxed for the first time. But your telephone bill was going to get whacked. It was like a 30% tax on telephones. And we eliminated that to 5%. We flattened it.
This is a new economy.
Right.
Tax structure also needs to reflect that. We talk so much about Virginia being one of only, I think, 13 states that still taxes food. Well, Virginia is one of, I think, fewer than 6 states that does not tax services. So
is that the coming storm? It almost has to. If our tax system should be based upon what the actual economy does and what we do as a people. It's the imbalance there is incredible.
50 years ago, 1970s, the average household began paying more on services than they did on goods, and yet we only tax goods in Virginia, and most every other state also is taxing services. So I'm paying taxes on the laundry soap, but not on taking something to the cleaners. And that, when we're talking about equity and ability to pay and the real kitchen table needs, well, not taxing food. I'm not taxing Walmart, but I'm also not taxing Wegmans.
Right.
And whereas if I'm taxing
full disclosure,
consumer services as a balance to not taxing food, I've filled the gap. Schools are made whole, localities are made whole, transportation is made whole, and the tax system is that much fairer.
So we should go. I've long thought that we should go to tax and services and just rebalance the thing.
Yeah.
Because we're out of balance. Our tax code in Virginia is a mid-19th century tax code, and we're almost at the end of the first quarter of the 21st century. We're 75 years out of balance. And I think those disparities are showing in certain areas around the state, and is becoming the calcitrance of people to get through these difficult seasons, because we get trapped in 60 days and 46 days. And then someone says, well, we got to have tax reform. And they run on it. And we've had statewide candidates do this, and they come in and go, oh, we can't make it work.
And that's one of the real downsides of a one-term governor, that you can promise anything, the bumper sticker, no car tax,
Right.
but you don't have to live with it. The General Assembly has to live with it, and the people have to live with this. And as you say, I worked hard a couple of years ago and finally got a century-old provision that counties aren't sophisticated enough, so we're not going to trust them with taxes, that we'll trust the budget decisions with cities. So only 2 years ago, 100 years later, do we equalize Fairfax with 1.1 million plus people with a city that might have 20,000.
For Fairfax City? Was that the equalization?
Fairfax City is probably 30,000, but
still,
the 10 biggest jurisdictions in Virginia, 6 of them are counties.
Right. Should we get rid
and
of
they are still being, up until 2 years ago, only had the authority that they had in colonial times to tax real estate, whereas cities without referendum have just gone ahead. And so this is where you're seeing we did have to get it through. There were some caps, and so there's a 40-cent cap on tobacco products per pack, but that's why you're seeing more and more counties pick up on that particular source of revenue.
Because they're forced to.
There
are very few options.
They now can, which they couldn't before. And for a number of them on some of our interstate routes, it's also, they know that people are going through Virginia buying cigarettes as they head out to their home state.
Right.
So it becomes a source of revenue that is not just on their own people, which, I mean, I could argue against every single tax. I can give you all the reasons why it's unfair. And this is a conclusion from my citizen days when I first started here. The challenge is to get a tax system that balances out those inequities, that makes sure that the demand for services, the source of where the revenue is, the way it responds to the economy. So when the economy goes up and down in different ways, you have some resiliency. There's all kinds of things that should be part of our tax system, and we're pretty darn rigid and pretty outdated.
Is it because we just go from election cycle to election cycle? We just kind of, and it's just to your point, and this is sort of the duality I see in Delegate Vivian Watts joining us today, is you have this exuberance, this earnestness to solve these problems, and you come back year after year and keep fighting the fight. You never get down. You've got a smile on your face. It's 8 o'clock in the morning. You're ready to go to battle. You've got all your facts, charts, figures, whatever you want to do. And still, it's so difficult to make change down here, but you never give up.
Well, but
why is that? What is it about Vivian Watts?
When
Tell me about that.
But Chris, when you said that, there is still the introvert who, I have an excuse now that I'm a politician to talk to people.
There's no way you're an introvert. You're animated. It's so early in the morning and you're doing this.
No, I'm an introvert. And so the politician now has an excuse to talk to people, and people are pretty darn interesting, particularly for we introverts who tend to listen more. So I'm out campaigning, really, really enjoying that. And yet here I am sitting, having spent a lot of time in a lot of different ways with the tax structure. And I know that I have just touched the third rail when I happen to mention that maybe we might tax taking something to the cleaners. Because this is where I can argue against every single tax, and I know that outside the full context of the reform we're talking about, any one of these things can be taken out of context against me, which is one reason why you don't talk about tax reform, and then along comes somebody, looks at the negative, oh God, the car tax, the way in which it's collected, awful. And so it became a way to win an election.
It was very powerful.
Absolutely. It wasn't done
brilliant
properly.
Brilliant bumper sticker. No car tax was a brilliant political campaign.
And yet everybody's still paying the car tax, by the way. So it was a great way to get it just is one of those things that unfortunately is used politically, and there's not enough serious effort at really looking at what we need to do. When I talk about consumer services, JLARC in 2012, which is now more than a decade ago, says, you need to look at this. Virginia is one of the few states that doesn't, and therefore our retail sales tax collections are a smaller part of our budget. 70% of our budget comes from the income tax. And we don't have the breadth that we might otherwise. But anyway, we're getting into a lot of details of that half hour with a chalkboard that we need to spend.
It's probably mind-numbingly complex for people. But this is where it happens.
Mm-hmm, that's right.
These things matter, and you talked about you're able to make the connection between the disparity at the local level, the disconnect, the difficulties we see socially when these things manifest themselves. And yet we don't seem to make the progress that we want to make.
Right.
And yet Vivian Watts keeps coming down here and slugging away at this thing.
Hopefully I'll make a little difference.
Well, that's the whole thing, right?
That's all you can do.
That's all you can do.
Yeah.
Vivian, it has been a pleasure. It's always been a pleasure to work with you.
Absolutely.
You've
you too,
been
Chris.
a ray of sunshine. Every time I've spoken to you, you never seem to be down, no matter how intense it gets in the General Assembly. And I can't thank you enough and commend you enough for all your work and effort on behalf of the Commonwealth. And you're running again.
I am running again. Absolutely. Yep.
Pretty
For some reason, I'm able to keep going.
With your energy, I'm not surprised, and I wouldn't be surprised at all to not see you back here. So thanks again, Vivian.
Great. Thank you so much. Right.
Thanks for joining us on the VIP podcast. My friend, former colleague, and guest, Vivian Watts from Northern Virginia, Annandale?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Annandale. Go Annandale Adams, right?
Yes. Good memory.
There we
yes.
go. We had a cousin that went there. Chris Saxman on the VIP podcast. Vivian Watts, she's a VIP for being on the VIP podcast. She's also a VIP. Anyway, but this is Chris Saxman on the VIP podcast, brought to you by VCTA, the Broadband Association of Virginia, and Virginia Free. Thanks for joining us.